Well, I got the title when one time I was speaking to my mother about a nefarious Jewish mobster from Detroit that we knew growing up. I knew the family, and he was a killer. And so I said to him, and I was giving her the stuff that I got from the FBI files, and I said, that guy was sleazy. Louis Fleischer was sleazy, and he did this. And she listened to me, and she said, well, that may be true, but he was always good to his mother. So I said, Mom, that's it. That's the title. And so when I wrote the book, my object was that it should be factual, using FBI files and interviews with old-time mobsters who were in their late 80s and early 90s. I managed to get to them. I had a godfather who helped me out in that. And FBI files and newspaper, but I wanted it to be entertaining. I wanted it to be a different kind of book, and it turned out to be that way.
Why did some members of the Jewish community decide to become Jewish gangsters?
Okay. Well, here you're talking about men, most of whom never finished high school, and yet they want a good life. They don't want to work in a shop. They don't want to stand on their feet all day in a factory. But you want the good life. You want money. You want cars. You want fancy homes.
Can I ask you, though,
Yeah.
Was it because, I think you quote in the book, that maybe they were uneducated, and perhaps it was because they came from Eastern Europe? There was no opportunities for them in the United States when they came?
Well, most of them were born in the United States or came as children. So they
Children
grew
of
up.
immigrants.
Yes, they were the children of immigrants. Most of the parents were from Eastern Europe. They knew what they were doing was not an acceptable or credible way to make a living. They knew it. And the men that I interviewed, these old-time mobsters, when I asked them the direct question, and I have them on tape, most of them, some of them said, I don't want to be taped. Meyer Lansky did not want any of this, but fine, okay. And but when I asked them directly, are you sorry for what you did? None of them said they were sorry for what they did, but they were all sorry that what they did caused shame to the family.
Did they try and justify their activities?
To me, I've read enough about it, and they rarely gave interviews. Al Capone would give interviews, but these men didn't want to give in because then it showed the family. They didn't get interviews. When I asked them about that, they justified it. Most of them, when they talked about it, and they said, "I was uneducated." Mickey Cohen said it. "I'm an uneducated man. Where could I have reached the position that I've reached if I didn't do what I did?" He said, I know congressmen and senators and actors. He was in Hollywood, and he talked about all the famous people he knew, etc. He said, where could I have ever met people like this if I had followed another quote-unquote line of work? If you take a look at Prohibition, which was in the 20s, 50% of the leading bootleggers, not the guys who are making some gin in their bathtub, but the leading ones, the top men, half of them were Jewish.
Was the prohibition of alcohol the start, would you say, of the career of the Jewish gangster?
Before Prohibition, you had in the large cities like New York, you already had Jewish gangs. There's one, a name comes to mind right away in New York, Monk Eastman, who had a gang of 1,500 Jewish men. They worked for politicians. During elections, they would make sure that people voted the right way. And, they had their running battles with the Italians, the 5 Points Gang, the Pug Uglies, and others. But that was before. So, and his parents lived in a nice home. They had a business, but he wasn't interested. And so even before Prohibition, but Prohibition really opened the door.
It was a kickstart.
Boy, it was, because the American public wanted to drink. I've said many times, once they passed that law, it seemed like every American above the age of 12 had to have a drink. And in a matter of a year, 200,000 illegal bootlegging establishments, speakeasies they called them, when you knock on the door, speakeasy, opened up in the United States. In other words, you pass a law where people are not going to obey that law. They're going to get what they want, whether it's illegal or legal, and that's what opened the door. And Al Capone said it a number of times. Why do they want to put me in jail? Some of my best customers are judges You know, everybody was drinking. In the White House, they had, you know, you'd come in and they'd ask, what do you want? So here you have prohibition. The president or his secretaries or the cabinet members are inviting you and offering you liquor and stuff like this. So it was a joke. Everybody was breaking it. On the one hand, you're trying to put these guys in jail. On the other hand, you go to the speakeasy in the evening and enjoy yourself and listen to good music and things like that.
And this made the Jewish gangster very rich.
Very, very. Unfortunately, many of them, the men I spoke to, they, you know, you have a lot of money, but it goes through your fingers. Easy come, easy go. I won't say it was easy, but many of them, you know, just spent their money on all kinds of things. They had the good life in their 20s and 30s, maybe in their 40s, and then things changed. A number of them made more money going legitimate than they did in illegal things, but most of them could not make a living legally. Many of them. They knew how to do it illegally. But when prohibition ended, a lot of them had problems, serious problems, because everything they put their money in failed. Bowling alleys, restaurants, and things. And, you know, when you lose your money, you lose your money.
You included in the book a quote from Mayor Lamsky.
Yeah.
And violence was a poor substitute for brains.
Yeah,
in other words, he didn't want to use the shotgun. He wanted to use his seichel
right.
in order to be successful.
He did, because even when he was part of the mob, his friend Lucky Luciano and everything, they always would laugh about, gee, Meyer likes to read books. I mean, God forbid you should read a book, right? He was always intellectually inclined, very bright. He said something to me once, very interesting. He said, don't gamble. He said, you're not going to win. The house wins 83% of the time. I mean, not 80, not 85, 83, had it down to a science. And he said, but if you want to try it just to see what it's like, blackjack is your best bet. But he said, you're not going to win. And it's true, in a way. And he said, I didn't have to have illegal games because I, you know, won my house, the house won 83% of the time, so he made money on it. And, you know, he was a very bright man.
Did the parents disown their children?
Well, you know, it's an interesting story. Many times, you know, the fathers would be disowned, but the mother would be connected. You know, the Yiddish mama.
And hence the title.
Yes. I mean, she, you know, on the other hand, they tried their best to keep their families separate. Now, a lot of people, they've asked me, whether it's been on TV shows or in the radio or stuff, they didn't know. They didn't know. I mean, you know, we talk.
The parents didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, didn't they know? Bernard Madoff's children and wife didn't know, and all this kind. You know, I investigated it, and there were a number of gangsters who were married to a rabbi's daughter. Okay, especially one comes to mind, Irving Wexler, better known as Waxy Gordon. His wife was the daughter of an Orthodox rabbi. She didn't know. I mean, where was the money coming from? They had a beautiful apartment here and a house there, and his son, unfortunately, got killed in an accident, but was in medical school and all that. Where'd the money come? He's a businessman. Bugsy Siegel's wife, he's a businessman. I mean, if you ask the daughters, he was a businessman. And so they did their very best to kind of separate their family or their personal life from, quote-unquote, their business.
So did they... in some respects, maybe keep some Jewish traditions?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, most of them went home for Friday night meals, for the typical Friday night meal.
Also in your book, actually, which was quite, it brought a smile to my face, where some gangsters went to synagogue on Yom Kippur.
Oh, yes.
And they were being monitored by
Oh, yes. That was in Detroit, in Congregation B'nai David, which I was once youth director there many years ago. They went, FBI agents or federal agents went there dressed as Hasidic Jews, because that's what they assumed Jews, you know, were like. And they stayed there in the service, and then at the break, you know, in between the, you know, the Shachrit and Mincha, and so they went outside and they smoked. And so that broke their cover right away, because people said, "Who are these guys?" And you know, these Hasidim are smoking, you know, on Yom Kippur. What, you know?
Yes.
So that did it. I mean, so yeah, they had that, and many of them did, you know, did honor their parents in that way. That the Friday night meal, and some even took, as the father was older, to synagogue on Saturday. If you grow up in a certain way,
right,
what you may do as a business or what you may do to earn a living, it's very difficult to get rid psychologically of the traditions and things that you grew up with. That doesn't mean if you grew up in an Orthodox home, that you remain Orthodox all your life. But it's very difficult psychologically to totally divorce yourself. Now, they grew up in Jewish communities. It's not like they were living in an Italian or Irish or German area. And they stayed connected with the families. Now, what do they do? These men had this sense of their Jewish identity, and it was shown in terms of the numbers of them that helped in the creation of the State of Israel.
One former Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, she refused to sanction the aliyah of one of the Jewish
Meyer
gangsters.
Lansky. Yeah, and when I spoke to him about it, he exploded. You know what? I don't want to make him angry. You know, I mean, we're on first name basis and all this kind of stuff, because he said, my friends call me Meyer. I said, okay, Meyer. But he was angry not so much at Golda Meir as he was as Joseph Berg was the Minister of the Interior. And he started, he really lost his temper. He says, who the hell does he think he is? Does he own the State of Israel? Of course, my comment after living in Israel for over 40 years was, Meyer, there are some people in Israel who see it as their private business in a way. But yeah, but he had help. He did help. He was connected to the Italian mafia. They controlled the docks of New York and New Jersey. These, the Teamsters.
But just going back onto that, Robert, do you think that he should have been allowed to come here under the law of return, or was it a political decision?
Part of it was political because, from what I've heard and read and spoken to people who were involved in it, there were two things that impacted. According to one report, Golda Meir was kind of dozing off, at these cabinet meetings. And there was a discussion about it, and someone mentioned mafia. Well, the mafia. And when he was in Israel, he was visited by underworld characters from the United States.
Right.
A couple of them were put back on the plane and sent out. Okay, he only spent a couple of months in jail in his life, and that was for vagrancy back in the 50s. Come on, I mean, they couldn't really get him on anything. But at any rate, she heard mafia. She kind of woke up and said, mafia, no mafia in Israel, no mafia in Israel. Like we don't have crime in Israel, right? And then the other thing was the threat by the United States that if Israel did not deport him,
right,
that the United States might reconsider selling Phantom jets to Israel.
Can I ask you,
Sure.
we spoke about, just briefly ago, about prison. Did any of the Jewish gangsters come out of prison a reformed character?
A few did. Charlie Workman was convicted. And how did they get to him? He was tough. They called him the Bug. The police were interrogating him, and he didn't break. He was a tough guy. And what they said to him was, okay, we're going to bring your family in to vouch for your good character. And then he said something interesting. I got the transcripts. He said, no, please don't. Don't shame me in front of my family. I'll tell you what you want to know. And so he confessed. He was sent to jail. He spent 20-something years in jail, and then he was released, and he became a tie salesman in New York.
Really?
Yeah, he did not continue in the old business.
Did any of the Jewish gangsters have any regrets about what they did?
Yeah, the regret was that they shamed the family. That I got that from almost everyone.
Really?
Would they have
That was
done
a general
things?
consensus.
Yeah, it was a consent. Would they have done anything differently? None of them said it to me. That maybe they were trying to impress me. I mean, these are men in their late 80s. And the fun thing about interviewing them was when they started talking, they projected themselves back in time to the 20s and 30s when they were young men and vigorous and all this. The regret they had that they shamed the family, and it impacted on their children. Would they have done something differently? What could they have done in terms of uneducated men who wanted the good life, wanted the excitement of this? Actually, it wasn't that exciting. I mean, when they weren't involved, they were just sitting around all the time in, cafes or their, wherever they met, and sitting around. I mean, so it's hard to say. I imagine if push came to shove, that they would say, if I had it to do over, I wouldn't have done that because I saw what it did to my family. There's what do they call it, pintele yid, a spark of Jewishness that they can't get rid of, or they can't cover it up. It's there. Bugsy Siegel, for all his violence and craziness, hated the Nazis, hated anti-Semites. Meyer Lansky, for all the bad things he may have done, did what he could to help Jews, did things against the Nazi. When Longy Zwillman protected Jews when he was growing up. I mean, on one hand, maybe he was robbing from them, a peddler, but on the other, protected the neighborhood.
When you interviewed these Jewish gangsters,
Yeah.
did it come across as you understanding, giving them respect? How did you feel when you
With them?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, they were so excited when I would come. I have to laugh because it brings me back to that. They would be talking with each other, and I would come into the room where they had been gathered. And I remember one of them saying, "Shut up, you guys, shut up. The professor from Israel is here, shut up." You know? I mean, for them it was like, wow, look at this guy, professor from Israel, is interested in our lives, you know.
So how did you feel to them?
And I, you know, related to that because they were like Zadie's grandfathers, you know. I mean, it was like going to...
Did you feel them as criminals?
I felt that these were men who had led a kind of life that the average Jew had no concept of, that was totally divorced from normal Jewish existence, whether it's in London. I mean, you had criminals there in England, Jewish criminals and others, but I mean, totally divorced from the average Jew growing up in the United States. Bugsy Siegel was friends with George Raft. Same neighborhood. George Raft becomes a movie star who plays gangsters in the movies, and Bugsy Siegel follows this path, right? So when I interviewed them as grandfathers, as people I was interested in, whose lives I were interested in, and I was not judgmental.
Do you think it would be harsh for us to judge them?
You can judge them if you want, but it would be harsh because they grew up at a different time in a different era, and you know, you don't justify what they did. Killing, how do you justify? You know, they kept saying we only, you know, bothered people in the business, you know, guys are hurt, you know, and all this kind of stuff. But on the other hand, these were men who had few options in their life. You say, well, they could have gone straight. Yes, they could have. But what kind of job, unless he was super brilliant intellectually or in business, can an uneducated person aspire to?
Do you think there are any lessons for the generation we're living in today? When they read your book, do you think there are any lessons we can learn?
Yeah, crime really at the end doesn't pay. They ended badly. The average gangster did not live to a fulfilling, wonderful life where he was honored by the community. That's such a small minority. Bugsy Siegel said, "Live fast, die young, and have a good-looking corpse." Well, he died with a few bullets in his head and one of his eyeballs 25 feet away from where he was sitting. So he didn't, you know, he lived fast and he did die young in the age of 40-something, and Arnold Rothstein was young when he got killed. And Longy Zwillman was killed by compatriots. You know, I mean, it's.
Should we feel sorry for these characters or not?
Not really, because they chose the path of life that they wanted to lead. They could have left it.
Did the Jewish gangster give any of their proceeds to perhaps Jewish good causes?
Yes. In fact, many of them later in life tried to attain the respect that they didn't have as young men. So they became involved in Israel-related activities. Modalitz was honored by the State of Israel a number of times and by B'nai B'rith.
Do you think the Jewish gangster was looked at as a role model by...
No. Jewish parents, no, terrified. I mean, my mother's an example. Don't go into that cafe, that place that frequented by the gangsters, because they
knew the
romance
of being
the romance or the money when they were young, the money, the big cars.
So an 8-year-old boy. You know,
of course. You look at that and you say, wow, an 8 or 9-year-old boy, 10-year-old boy, looking at that, beautiful clothes, blonde girlfriends, of course, big cars, you know, and wow, it's attractive. How can I get some of that? How can I grow up to get that? Parents were terrified of that, terrified that this would attract them. You know, and they had a reason to be.
Do you think also, maybe, Robert, that the American agencies were to blame because they weren't immune for taking bribes, were they, and making the jobs a little bit easier?
You mean like judges or police or things? Oh yeah, oh yeah. The classic story, one of the stories that I tell is Jay Guzik, because it was printed and it was written about, where they said he kept suing newspapers that talked about him as being a gangster. He was Al Capone's treasurer. He made a lot of money for Al Capone. And when Al Capone went to jail, he said, "My best friend is Jake." He was the only one who kept in touch with him and made sure that the family had money and things, which is very interesting. The Jew. And he was part of the Capone mob. And then later on, when Capone died, he helped the others in terms of... but they asked, his friend said to him, "What do you keep suing the newspapers for? You're not going to win." And he said, "Look, I'm paying those judges good money, and I want to make use of them." So, yeah, they were on the take. If you can say, if a policeman can make $40,000 extra, not to commit a crime, but just not to be in a certain place at a certain time every week, so he'll be somewhere else and he'll get an envelope with, or they got envelopes with money.
When did it
really
conclude?
It concluded with, you could say in the 50s, the 1950s, where these men are already reaching their 60s, and they got out of it. The family, the children were growing, and they wanted to be respectable, and that was it. With them, it was one generational.
Just finally, can I ask you what motivated you to write this book?
Well, as a kid, I remember I remember the family whispering about, and my Zadie, my grandfather, my beloved they raised me, my grandparents. My mother was a widow, and so she went to work, and we all lived together. He peddled. He's a peddler, educated man, but peddled. He was an immigrant to America with the father of killers, purple gangsters in Detroit. And I remember the family as a child whispering about it. But you know what? I always enjoyed gangster movies. And I wrote, my first book was A History of the Jews of Detroit. And I kept coming across names. And I wanted to do something different. And I always was interested in the Prohibition era, but a certain aspect of it. And I did something that very few people did at the time. And let me tell you, it wasn't the most popular thing at Tel Aviv University, that there's this professor in the Department of Jewish History who's writing about Jewish gangsters. Let me tell you, you pay a price, but I enjoyed it. As I said to one of my deans, who said, "Well, you got to do something serious." I said, "Look, we have to write to be promoted and get tenure and all this. And if it has to be something you're interested in, and that
And did you enjoy writing it?
I sure did. And I enjoyed interviewing them, and it was so much fun writing about it. Because if you read the book, you find out that my language, I write very simple English, easy to understand. But sometimes my language becomes like they were talking. I mean, it becomes like gangster talk. And listen, we know that there are a lot of them, because there have been encyclopedias of gangster slang in Holland, in Germany, and in the United States. And there are a lot of words in Yiddish that appear there now. Is it because the non-Jewish gangsters spoke Yiddish? No, it's because there were large numbers of Jewish criminals, and their slang in Yiddish enters into the underworld language or slang. So, yeah, it drew me. It was something that I enjoyed doing. You had to wait years to get FBI files, but I hate to say fun, but it was fun in a way. It was something unique, and the experience in meeting these men, it told me about a side of life I personally had no idea about, and so it was a learning experience in a way.
It was a unique piece of a new period of history, because this could never be repeated again.
Not in that way, no. It was one generational with these men. There are Jewish criminals in Israel and in Europe and in the United States, but it's not like it was with these men. These men were significant factors in the creation of organized crime in America during the Prohibition era. Very significant.
After having read your book, I found it a very, very entertaining read.
Wow, thank you.
It was a very, very easy read. There were some very humorous moments,
yes.
Some very, very informative anecdotes, and I think lots of lessons to learn. And I can't thank you ever so much for taking the time to chat to Jewish on Magazine about your book. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.